Morning.
Morning. There's this roll call thing on the agenda, and I still haven't quite figured out how that's supposed to work. But maybe we should all go around and do a quick introduction. Is that what a roll call means to you? Okay. I am Emily Kornheiser. I represent Brattleboro, and I'm here as a representative of the House of Representatives. That was a lot of representatives in one Monday morning sentence. Nicole, do you want to go next?
Sure, Nicole Mace. I am a school board trustee from Winooski, representing the Vermont School Boards Association.
Anne?
I'm Ann Cummings. I'm one of the senators from Washington District, and I'm here representing the Vermont Senate. I also chair the Finance Committee in the Senate.
Mike?
Mike Licklider. I'm the superintendent of the Harwood Unified Union School District, and I'm here as a representative of the Vermont Superintendents Association.
Thanks. Zoe?
Hi, good morning. I'm Zoe Saunders, Interim Secretary of Education.
Elizabeth and then Craig.
I'm Elizabeth Jennings. I am the Director of Finance and Operations for Addison Northwest School District, and I'm here representing the Vermont Association of School Business Officials.
Morning, everybody. I'm Craig Bolio, Tax Commissioner.
Thanks, everyone. So I think we are all here. I don't have any amendments to the agenda, though I am unclear if the timing is going to work perfectly, but we will figure it out as we go. But we'll take a stretch break at 11:15 and adjourn at 1. Any other amendments to the agenda from anyone? Okay. And the meeting minutes, do I have a motion to approve those? Don't all jump at once.
I'll move approval.
Thanks, Anne. Any conversation about that? Discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of approving the minutes from November 18th?
Aye.
Hi.
Aye.
I thank you, everyone, and just want to really thank Marie and Suzanne, the team from AOE, who has been supporting us and the other committees and commissions all doing this work this year, in addition to the rest of their workload. So grateful for even attempting to take minutes and how incredibly good the minutes are. Thank you. Next up, we have the public to be heard. Is there anyone from the public who would like to speak? Please raise your virtual hand and I will call on you. So we have one person, I believe, Alan Gilbert. The floor is yours for a few minutes.
Today, you'll be discussing foundation formulas today, I believe. And I'm surprised that neither Larry Pikus nor the AOE consultants have mentioned in their discussions and reports the 2023 decision of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court that parallels Vermont's Brigham decision. The complaint in both cases was that foundation formulas result in denial of equal educational opportunities for school children. At the end of the 786-page long Pennsylvania decision, the court ruled that, quote, students who reside in school districts with low property values and incomes are deprived of the same opportunities and resources as students who reside in school districts with high property values and incomes. The disparity among school districts with high property values and incomes and school districts with low property values and incomes is not justified by any compelling government interest, nor is it rationally related to any legitimate government objective. And as a result of these disparities, petitioners and students attending low wealth districts are being deprived of equal protection of law, unquote. Using the foundation formula for school funding is, as was declared in Vermont 27 years ago, unconstitutional. Pennsylvania has not been able to move as fast as Vermont in correcting the deprivation of equity for many of its school children. The Pennsylvania legislature was finally able, in a bill passed this July, to shore up school funding for poor districts this school year. But as one of the plaintiffs, the Public Interest Law Center of Philadelphia said, quote, "The Pennsylvania Constitution requires more. The governor and General Assembly have acknowledged the wide scope of the problem. Now they must identify the timeline by which the students of Pennsylvania will receive the funding the Constitution demands and do so with the urgency that children deserve and need," unquote. Pennsylvania needs to provide equitable funding for all its schools without an unconstitutional foundation formula. That's what Vermont has been doing since our landmark Brigham decision in 1997. Thank you.
Thank you. And if you could share those references with us so we can look them up ourselves, that would be really helpful. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Gilbert. Anyone else from the
You're
public
welcome.
would like to speak? Okay, in that case, we will move on to our first agenda item, which is a data review from the Agency of Education.
Hi, good morning, everyone. We provided a number of different reports to the commission. So we gave you an early release of the updated state profile report. So hopefully you had an opportunity to review that. It includes some corrections along with expanded analysis related to expenditures, which I think will be helpful for our conversation in being able to isolate expenditures from the education fund specifically. So one of the things that, as we look through that analysis, I'll give you a couple key takeaways from the report. Overall, the statewide trends remain very similar. What we did see in terms of changes was as we were able to do some additional coding with the field and remove some duplicates, we actually saw a further decline in enrollment than was originally reported over the past 20 years. So you'll see that reflected in the report. And as we looked at different expenditures, what I think was interesting is we looked specifically at the education fund, that expenditures were relatively similar across different communities, and that there from the ed fund was not a meaningfully higher investment in higher poverty communities. So that's something to explore as we get into this conversation around equity and really thinking about kind of how our system is designed, and then what are some of the ways that that's actually coming into practice in terms of the spending patterns that we are seeing. We can delve a little bit deeper into that in our conversation. Additionally, for today, we've responded to the questions from the committee to pull together a number of different presentations for you today, which I will allow Amanda Brown from APA to walk through with you. And this is really looking specifically at expenditures from the education fund by object and function code. There are some really important nuances that we need to make you aware of in terms of this data and being able to provide some caution for interpretation given some changes in terms of how this was, how the data have been represented over the time period that we're presenting in terms of the use of the uniform chart of accounts and so forth. So just Amanda will be able to delve deeper into that, but I do think it will be able to provide some interesting insights for this conversation today. So with that, Amanda, I'll allow you to walk through the presentation of the expenditure analysis. Also, one other point I'll make as you're queuing up the slides, Amanda, we did provide a memo to the committee of an overview of kind of the considerations as you're looking at this analysis. And we also provided links to other relevant reports that are on our website that could be very useful for the discussion.
All right, everyone. Do we see some slides, hopefully? I'm going to see if I put them in presentation. Great.
Yeah, thank you. Perfect.
Great. Thank you so much. So as Zoe was saying, this is intended to provide some visuals and some look over time at the data that was provided. So we provided expenditures using the general fund as a proxy for the ed fund, as when you look at the expenditure side of data, the general or the ed fund is not specifically tracked. So this is the best proxy that we have for what those dollars are. But so we did a look at expenditures from FY14 forward. So we want to share a little bit of the key findings that we're seeing here. We shared what we can call a recipe card of how did we get to what we consider unduplicated expenditures. So that makes sure that you don't overaccount expenditures between SUs or between districts. So we followed that recipe card that we shared to eliminate those. And I want to highlight a couple things. So the Uniform Chart of Accounts, the UCOA, was not adopted until FY20. So that can make looking at kind of pre-FY20 information compared to the more recent years a little more challenging, because we don't think the way expenditures were coded or tracked was as reliable or consistent as it is now that everyone is using the same Uniform Chart of Accounts to code that information. So want to keep that in mind as we look kind of pre-FY20. We used the same kind of coding that we identified in that recipe code or card to do exclusions, but not all of those codes were in use prior to the UCOA, and we're not confident in how consistently they were applied. So again, just more cautions as we try to make those pre and post FY20 comparisons. And so some differences that we're going to see in totals are likely due to not being able to exclude some of those duplicated expenditures. And some differences might be, again, just changes in how folks coded information based on updated guidance when the UCOA came out. And last point that I mentioned briefly already is that we're just focused on the general fund. So Fund 1, kind of pre-UCOA, or Funds 1000 through 1999 post-UCOA, as a proxy for education fund expenditures. So with that, I'll start.
I'm sorry, I need to
Yeah.
ask a clarifying question, because
Please
I
do.
think you're using the general fund in a very different, for a very different meaning than is usually used statewide here. I imagine
Sure.
are you describing the general fund that districts have?
Yes. No,
Thank
that's a
you.
great.
Okay, 'cause
Thank
in
you for
the
that clarifier.
statewide, we have a general fund and an education fund. And I
No,
just wanted to make
great.
sure that the audience
Great.
was following along with what you were saying.
Appreciate that clarify. Yes, this is each SU's general fund. So, and that's where they primarily put their funds that come from the education fund, go into that fund, then be expended out. SUs and districts also then use different funds to identify other sources of revenue. So special revenues funds in districts or SUs would be where they might put grant funds, their federal funds, and then they have other funds like trust or custodial or capital and debt service funds. So we've really focused on just that general fund, which is where the majority of dollars for districts and SUs go into. Again, primarily from the education fund to be spent out from there. So thank you for that clarifier. I appreciate that. Okay. So staying with just statewide education fund expenditures, again, using that general fund as the best proxy that we have, looking over the period of time from FY14 to FY23, and what you see again distinguished here is kind of your green bars are your both pre-pandemic and pre-uniform charts of accounts. So we kind of had two big things happening at once when we look at the data that you have to keep in mind. And you can see we had some kind of fluctuating increases that were happening pre-FY20, and then more steady state increases that we kind of have seen since FY20 and the pandemic going forward. Again, a little caution that particularly when you look at that drop that we see FY19 to FY20, part of that is likely our ability not to exclude some of the duplicated expenditures that we're able to kind of FY20 forward. So just keep that caution that it might not be a true decrease of about 100 million that we're seeing, that it's likely that difference as we shift to the uniform charts of accounts that we can't quite capture in the prior years. And I see a hand from Nicole. Do we want to take questions as we go, I assume?
This is just a note or a wondering that drop in FY18, whether that corresponded with implementation of Act 46 in any way, in terms of, I think, much of the early activity around in terms of the voluntary folks who move forward voluntarily happened around that time frame. So I think that has been a conversation around whether Act 46 had any impact on ed spending, and so it'd be good to affirm at what point in the majority of the mergers came into effect, whether that was FY18 or not.
Nicole,
That is
thank
a-
you for sharing that and raising that. I think we're going to need to hold those kinds of observations until the end and just do clarifying questions as we're going through. But if folks could write them down and we can take time at the end to raise them, that would be great.
No, I
to you,
think
Megan.
I think it's a great question and a powerful consideration of what was going on at that time. And we'll see one other slide where we see a change in how dollars are being used that I also wonder if it's related to that piece. So going to the next slide. So then just looking at the most recent 4 years where we see that increase, thinking about this as a per student using long-term ADM as the metric of our student count, we see an increase in the general fund or the education fund expenditures from about $19,000 to a little shy of $22,000 in FY23. So then the next several slides are attempting to look at all those, the Ed Fund dollars that we saw on the preceding page and look at how dollars are being used. So the shares in different categories. So the first way we're going to look at it is by function, which is kind of the purpose of dollars. So for example, instruction or student or instructional support, school administration. And what you'll see here is, not surprisingly, the majority of dollars are in instruction. And kind of across all the years we looked at, the share of dollars in each category was pretty consistent. So that's why we're showing you really 3 different years here instead of every year, because there really wasn't much of a change, about a percentage point or 2 in any direction in most categories. So what you'll see here is FY23, which is the most recent year available, with FY19 is kind of that pre-pandemic year comparison, and then FY14 being the farthest back year and really representing a 10-year comparison. So going back to what I was just saying, we see a pretty steady amount that's going to instruction, somewhere around that 56 to 58%. And hang on just one second, I apologize.
We can have a discussion about
Apologize
this.
for that.
Oh.
So then you can also see some of the other larger categories in this are student support, which is that would be where you might see your social emotional support, your counseling, your psychology, your social work being represented by that next kind of dark green band, somewhere in the 7 to 9%. Another large category is school administration, which is that light blue, kind of 6 to 7%. And then gray is another large category, which is your maintenance and operations of your facilities. So not any construction, but just the ongoing expense of maintaining buildings, including energy costs and things like that. But one thing I did want to notice here, kind of to the earlier question, we do see kind of a decline over time in general administration that is interesting to look at, kind of 4 or 5% in FY14 and 19 to 2% in FY23. And again, interpreting everything with caution that there could be some of this is just differences in coding, but that was one place where there's kind of a noticeable difference across years when most of them were pretty steady state. So I'll move on to kind of looking at the same information now by object. So object is the item that's being purchased. So things like salaries and benefits, purchase services, supplies, or property, equipment. And what you can see here is that half of dollars go into salaries. Another about 17 to 19% are in benefits, and we do see that one increasing over the years. We can see from that 17 to 19%. Again, everything's pretty tightly bound year to year, not big changes in patterns. But one piece we do see some difference is purchase professional and technical services, kind of that navy blue bar in FY14 and 19. was about 12 or 14% when it's 5% when we look at FY23. We also see kind of a flip of that for other purchase services. That goes from 6 or 7% to 11%. So this is one where we see a bit of a flip-flopping, which to me makes me wonder if there was differences in how that information was coded, kind of pre-uniform chart of accounts to afterwards, because the overall scale in purchase services is fairly similar across the three categories of purchase professional and technical services, purchase property, and other purchase services. That makes me think there might have just been some changes in how expenditures were coded versus a real change in how dollars were used. So again, big takeaway here is very similar year to year in the share of how ed fund dollars are being used in districts and SU and STs. And the last slide takes both those pieces that we were just looking at and kind of attempts to look at them together. So what this is expenditures coded by object within function categories. So in the data we provided, there's some kind of cross tabs of the two information. So you can see within instruction how much is being spent in each of the object areas. And for simplicity, I collapse some of the categories together. So salaries and benefits are together, all purchase services, supplies, and then property, debt, and other. They're a pretty small percentage, so I just kind of collapsed them. And so it's interesting just to see the patterns within function areas that are perhaps not surprising. You see instructional, student support tending to be more people-oriented, more employees-oriented, that you have most of your dollars spent on salaries and benefits. Whereas you start to see perhaps instructional support, have more supplies, more purchase services, same for general administration. School admin, again, tends to be very people heavy. Central, you start to see more of those contracted services, same with maintenance and operations and transportation, where transportation becoming kind of predominantly contracts with likely bus vendors, that sorts of things. So it's just interesting to take a little deeper dive that we don't see a lot of differences across years, but we do see differences in how dollars are used to meet specific functions in districts and SUs. No, actually just leave it there. I meant to leave a question slide and I didn't. So any questions?
Were you, have you been able to look at this on a district to district basis at all? I'm really fascinated to see the consistency across years. And I'm curious if that consistency across years is about sort of sums or averages, or that districts are sort of having consistent experiences across years.
I think that's a great question. And we were able to provide the by SU, because most of the expenditures you really report the SU level versus the district, but we were able to provide that data. We have not taken that next step of digging in to see the variation that you might see kind of SU to SU, because I do agree. I think that's the next lens is does that look different in small settings versus larger, or based on need perhaps in how dollars are being used.
Amanda, could you expand on that a
Debbie?
little? Because I know in the re-release of the state profile report, there are some broader trends that you're highlighting in terms of expenditures from the ed fund related to need. And I think that's important to call out.
Yeah, no, thank you. So that is what we highlighted in the state profile report, is looking at total expenditures from the ed fund. So sorry, when I say total, I just mean not disaggregated by function or object, but just the per long-term ADM amount that we see from the education fund. We did do that looking at differences in experience for SUs based on grouping them by their size, so their number of long-term ADM, or also by their need using their FRL percentage. And I will say, when we looked at by need, we made the distinction between three groups based on their FRL percentage, so their free and reduced lunch eligibility, so the measure of their kind of economically disadvantaged students. And we did also see that in those settings, they tended to have higher special education and EL population. So while we just grouped them by FRL, there was actually kind of an overlap with the other ways you might think about need of students. And what we were seeing is that We did see a fair differential based on size of SU with higher general fund or ed fund expenditures in smaller settings. What we didn't see when we looked at them by need was a real differential between SUs based on their need. So it was about $1,000 difference between your lowest need and your highest need when you looked at just general fund expenditures or ed fund expenditures versus if you had looked at what we called operating expenditures that also considered expenditures from other sources like federal funds. We were seeing about a $5,000 difference between these need settings. So we were seeing fairly minimal difference when we looked at just state ed fund. But we have not looked at how do they then use those dollars differently in terms of function or object yet.
Is that something you could show us, Amanda?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
I struggle to retain and process numbers when someone's just saying them out loud.
I am
Nicole?
very visual too, so let me
Okay.
get that for you.
Thank you.
And so Amanda, based on that, I mean, some of the takeaways are the federal dollars are really helping to supplement for need is that how you would translate that?
I would say that they have a much stronger relationship with need, which is not surprising. Much of your federal dollars are your Title I dollars that are specifically tied to going towards low-income students, your IDA dollars for special education, and then even your ESSER dollars had rules about how they were distributed that, somewhat were aligned with Title I. So we were seeing those dollars have a really strong relationship with need, and then just less so when we looked at Ed Fund dollars. And I'll go ahead and share the.
And I think we've made this other point in previous presentations, but we're going to fiscal year 23 because fiscal year 24 data is still in its annual review. So as we're going through that process, we'll release additional data from fiscal year 24, but just wanted to call that out as well.
Yeah. So what I have on the screen now is the updated statewide report, and I'm going to take us just a half step back so you can understand how we kind of what we were calling peeled the onion, if you will. So in our initial release, we were really focused on total expenditures, and total expenditures being expenditures from all funds. So that includes the education fund, special revenues like federal funds, capital funds, debt service. It's really all the dollars that were in the system. So we started at that layer and then peeled down to what we called operating. And that was stripping aside capital, debt service, trust, custodial, some funds that kind of are less ongoing and really have a lot of variable expenses year to year. And then from there, we stripped it even further to look at that kind of core, that central layer of education fund expenditures. So just letting you know of kind of what you'll see in the state profile report that I'm going to kind of briefly share. So the first thing we looked at was just total expenditures per, again, long-term ADM by funds. So you can see what I was saying before, most of your dollars for districts, SUs and SDs are coming from your education fund. So from
Amanda, can you make that a little bit bigger?
Oh,
I'm
sure.
sorry.
Yeah. Oh, I can definitely make that bigger. How does that look?
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And then you can see on top of that about kind of 9 to 13% coming from special revenues, so including your federal sources, and then a small percentage in those other funds and how that has increased over time. So from there, we kind of, again, peeled that apart to say, okay, if you take off the top, those expenditures that are in, capital or debt service or custodial or trust funds, what is really what we called operating expenditures, a little more insight to what's kind of your current or ongoing. And what you can see is that continues to increase. And we thought this is an important perspective to look at because these are, again, really the dollars available to serve students and meet their needs. So what you can see is variation by size of category, the piece that we were talking about just a second ago, where you can see a real differential in the amount of funding that is provided between kind of low need, moderate need, and high need. When we look at the most recent year, and I think I said 5,000 before, it's 4,000. Sorry, little misspeak on my part. But you can see a lot more dollars being available to students when you consider all funding sources in high need settings. We then kind of take that last step of peeling the onion and you just saw this slide or this chart on the slides of this is the amount of funding that is going out through the education fund using the general fund as a proxy. So it's never going to tie up probably exactly to numbers you might see if you look at the revenue side. We continue to see the same pattern of increased expenditures based on size. And I didn't say it before, but kind of your smallest group is less than 10,050 long-term ADM to over 2,000 in your farthest. So that's kind of the bounds that we see here, about $4,000 difference there. When we then look at low need, moderate need, and high need again, we see where we had seen a pretty big difference between the two really shrink when we just look at education fund. So to me, that looks like we don't have a lot of education fund dollars specifically going out into our communities with higher need. I think that was all I had to share on this.
Thank you.
Piece.
Thank you. Nicole, you're next up. And then Zoe, I don't have a clear sense of the full breadth of what you want to cover in this hour. So I want to also defer to you if there are other sort of pieces of data that you want to make sure that we spend time on in this hour.
So we put together two specific presentations based on the request. So the expenditure analysis that we walked through just now, and then the second presentation is related to an overview of school size. So you can see that pattern across the state. So we can share that. I do think there's a lot of rich information in the state profile report related to this expenditure conversation that's really important, particularly as we're thinking about equity, and we lead into the conversation around a foundation formula. What we're seeing in this analysis is that we're not seeing meaningful difference in terms of ed fund spending in higher needs communities. We're seeing that when you're looking at all in the total spending that is inclusive of federal dollars. So I think that's important for us to recognize as we start to have these conversations around developing an equitable system. So I'll entertain questions, and I think we probably will reference back, Amanda, that expenditure analysis as the members have questions, because I think that'll be really instructive to guide the discussion around expenditures.
Nicole, and then we'll go to the next presentation.
Thanks. First of all, thank you. This is a lot of what I've been hoping to see and talking about, so appreciate this. It's I need a little bit more time to process and digest, but I'm appreciative of the presentation and the way the information is being presented. I want to note in terms of the equitable analysis that you just did, that FY23 is the year before the new weights came into effect. So it would be interesting to see how or whether that changes once the FY24 data are in. And then I'm hoping at some point, doesn't have to be now, but I do think part of the interest in presenting and looking at the data this way is to start to unpack the so-called cost drivers in the system. And it would be helpful for definitions around what's in student support versus instructional support, general admin versus school admin versus central office / finance admin, just some additional levels of definition so folks can we're all interpreting the information in a similar way. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I will share too, in the memo that was sent to the committee, there is a link to a former presentation where we defined the object and function codes. I will share that even within that, I agree. I think we can further expand that, but I just wanted to point you to that as a reference as we're having this conversation.
Mike, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. And this is just a wonder, and I would agree with Nicole, this is the kind of information that we've been hoping for, but just a wonder. And I know we've had some trouble with codes and figuring out things like the mental health piece, but Zoe, I would be really interested to see if there's any way we can look to see at the investment in curriculum development and instructional improvement as we talk about the test scores as well. I'd be curious to see what we're spending as a state at the district level on those areas. So again, it's not information we asked for before, but it was just a thought that came to me as she was presenting.
Interesting. So just to make sure I'm clear on the request, so it's breaking down the instructional category to understand what type of expenses are being used by
I'm
district.
particularly interested, like in curriculum development, how we're developing teachers.
Right.
When you get into professional development, you get into money spent on graduate courses and that piece. But really, how are we investing in meeting standards? How are we developing our curriculum to align with the standards and our assessments? And are we?
And I appreciate the question, right? Because all of this is around, how are we able to determine how that investment is translating into improved student outcomes, right? That's the core of these questions.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. This is really helpful. And I think having some more time to digest the materials that you sent on Friday will be really helpful for all of us. Thanks. So yeah, would love to see the next presentation.
Yeah, and that's what I might suggest because the result, it's really dense, the updated report. So I think it would be helpful for community members just to review that in detail, and then send us specific questions you might.
Anymore. Am I the only one?
I lost.
School size patterns. Did we lose her?
I got lost. I think I'm back. Am I back?
You're back.
Okay. I don't really understand what happened.
I think we all had a hiccup because I couldn't hear Zoe for a while and then everything froze.
Okay.
Same thing.
So
So I was just suggesting that
Thank you.
that committee members spend a little bit of time with the re-release state profile report because it is very dense. And that if you could submit specific questions you might have around that report, that would be helpful. And then that could inform the next meeting where we can dive into that. And then of course, and Nicole, you mentioned this, we right now do not have fiscal year 24. And so it will be very interesting as that data become available to do that extended comparison to the prior years with the new weights. And I'm not sure, did we, and Amanda, I think you're still on. So at this time, what we'd like to do is provide the overview of the analysis of school size, which I think is very interesting.
And Zoe, sorry, I don't think I was the one that was doing the size presentation.
Okay, let me just pull it up then. 1 second. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, and we can see sort of like your whole PowerPoint interface.
This better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Okay, great. So I think the team had questions just around doing the overview of school size so we can see the pattern. So this is grouped in a couple of different ways. First, we'll go through pre-K 12, grouped by 50. And when we're doing these groupings, the request was really around enrollment in schools. So understanding how many students are enrolled in the public schools was our understanding of the request. Sorry, can you hear me? It says my microphone's muted.
We can hear you.
Yeah.
Oh, that's weird because it's covering over here. I can't see the slides. So just along the left-hand side, you'll see again, this includes pre-K through 12th grade. And so these numbers represent the number of students that are enrolled in that school. So grouped by 50. And I'm trying to figure out how I can't see this, which makes it hard for you to see. Hold on 1 second. 1 second, sorry. I'm going to make this bigger so I can see, because when I was in presentation mode, I couldn't see. All right, sorry about that. So as we look through here.
Oh, now we can't hear you.
Now you can't hear me?
Oh, now we can. There's some major glitches happening in Teams land today. I'm sorry. Try again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, we
Okay,
can.
I'm sorry about that. Okay. And I'm having a little trouble here. Okay. So this is looking just at the number of schools. I'm really sorry here. I gotta get this right. Okay. And then basically what I think the question was understanding the distribution. You know, what are the average size that we have of students enrolled in our schools across the state? So this analysis does not get into any sort of geographic patterns or the relationship with need, although we have done some of that high level analysis within the state profile report. So here I think, you know, the major takeaways as we look at pre-K through 12th grade enrollment, kind of the largest percentage is within that 51 to 100 students in terms of size. This is another visual representation of that, just to be able to show in pre-K 12 where the majority of our schools sit in terms of average enrollment size. And I think this is a helpful visual just to show that when we look at pre-K through 12, the majority of our schools are enrolling anywhere from 50 to 100 students or 100 to 150 students. So that's the pattern that we see in terms of the average school size.
Zoe, does this include independent schools?
This data request was specific to our public schools.
Okay, thank you.
Again, I think this is just another representation looking at it in terms of percentage. Then the next grouping is by 100 students, just to see that pattern. So again, I think it shows very similar trends, but basically what we're seeing here is that, 20% of our schools enroll between about 100 students, and then about 25% of our schools, which is the next highest category, would be between 100 and 200 students, followed by 200 to 300 students. And then you can see we have very few schools that would enroll, above 600, and certainly very few that would be in the thousands. Again, this is just another visual representation of that, so you can see the actual number of schools in that range, and then this slide is showing you the percentage. Then we move into looking at it by K-12, so excluding pre-K enrollment. I think you're seeing similar patterns emerge here when you're looking at this. We certainly see that again, enrollment of 51 to 100 students is the highest percentage of our students of our schools across the state. So that seems to be the most typical size when you're looking at that distribution just for K through 12. This is another visual representation of actually the counts and the number of students. So that's 52 schools that enrolls 51 to 100 students, 44 schools that enroll between 101 and 150. And then the next highest category would be 36 schools that have enrollment of 200 to 250 students. And then again, this is K-12, so we looked at it in the context of grouped by 50, sizes of 50 increments, and then this next section is grouped by 100. Again, I think this kind of gives us zooms out a little bit to see the patterns. And I think what we're really seeing, and I think these charts show visually, that our school size, the average is enrolling between 100 and 200 students. That's the most typical within our school system across the state. And then this is looking at it by percentage. So I can go to any specific slide, but I think this was just a specific request to really understand the average enrollment patterns of our public schools. Any specific, I think, Nicole, I see your hand up, and Mike, I see your hand too.
Mike, I think you were up first if you have a question.
No, I was just going to comment. This is, again, some of the information that we asked for, and I think it's very helpful. It's very interesting to see. I want to digest this a little bit more. I think I have some more questions, but not at the moment.
Okay. Good. I'm glad that this is responsive to the request. So thank you for sharing that.
Yep, one same point I was gonna make. We had also maybe not explicitly requested this, but I think part of the conversation has been around communities that maintain small schools because of geographic necessity versus communities that maintain small schools out of preference. And that a mapping of that, of the locations of schools might be helpful in sort of, again, trying to unpack some of this. And then the other point I just wanted to make is that when you look at that distribution, to me, it points to, and the underlying assumptions of the PICUS modeling were that Vermont schools would serve 400-ish students, just sort of what a misalignment that is with our current reality. And so if we were to move to something like approaching that level of scale, that would represent a very large shift in how we currently deliver education, and that's not something that could be accomplished overnight and without some significant investment in our infrastructure to support serving that larger numbers of students.
I think it's really interesting for us to look at the typical school size, right? I think that this is really helpful. I appreciate that you submitted the request. To your next point around how do we actually interpret this in terms of geography, right? And so to your point, are we small by necessity or small by choice? And there's different strategies that you might deploy to be able to reach the scale that's needed. We did include in the updated state profile report a number of additional maps, but I think it would be really helpful and instructive to have maps where we actually have the pinpoint for the specific schools. So we'll need to think about how to structure that in a way that can be really well understood. But yes, I think that would be valuable for our planning, because right now we're just seeing it kind of at a high level, but I do think we need to put it within the community context. So I appreciate that, and we'll work on that.
And along with that, I'm wondering, we had some conversations with Jill Briggs Campbell when we were working on this request about how this also interfaces with the data we have from the construction study last year. Mm-hmm. Yep. And again, I think how that could be overlaid, but as I'm starting to contemplate that information, I wonder, is there any correlation between school size and need for capital infrastructure?
Yes, so I know that that's a request, and that's something that we're very interested in pulling together, because part of this conversation is also understanding the capacity utilization of a building as well. So when you're thinking about achieving scale and we're looking at that, that would be another factor in the conversation, as well as understanding the deferred maintenance issues, right? So when you're thinking about investment, and I know the School Construction Aid Working Group is looking at this, how do you make sure that you're maximizing those dollars, right? And investing in those spaces that could best serve students. It may have less deferred maintenance than others, and can be easier to improve and retrofit for the needs of students. So I do think that's going to be a really important part of this conversation, as we're really thinking tactically around what would this look like in terms of best meeting the needs of students, and really capitalizing, for lack of a better word, on the infrastructure that we have, right? There is a component of this around the built infrastructure, which is very expensive to maintain and make improvements to buildings. So we need to be really strategic about that and thoughtful. And we will be analyzing that further. And I really love the maps, because I think it helps us to see it in a visual way and really recognize the nuance of our enrollment patterns across the state. So I'm a big proponent of bringing that together. We just need to think a little bit about how to do the layering effectively in the maps. I often ask for like 4 different layers, and they're like, no, that's not useful. So sometimes it just takes a little bit to get to the right visual demonstration, but I absolutely agree that that work needs to be connected. And we have a lot of the information. We're just needing to figure out how to represent that well.
Zoe, do you want to stop sharing your screen?
I thought I did stop sharing.
Yeah.
Can, is it just me? I can't see anyone anymore.
I think it might just be you, Emily.
I can see everyone.
Yeah, I can see everyone.
So awkward. Okay.
Yeah, the Teams has been a little challenging today. I think Teams is ready for Thanksgiving break.
I like that about Teams today. Okay. So we've looked at those two presentations. I feel like the next step is to really see what happens when we meld those two ideas together and see what comes of it, right? And we're looking forward to that and appreciate you getting there and all this work. We have another 20 minutes or so on this section of our agenda. I wonder if it's helpful to actually look at that sort of data request spreadsheet together, or if there's something else you would rather be doing with this time, Zoe.
Certainly, we can do that. Meaning what I sent on Friday with the updates of the status request.
Yes, thank you.
Let me just pull that up real quick.
Okay. And I moved you all onto a funny little shelf and now I can see you. So in case anyone was worried, you all look ridiculous.
All right, so as I'm pulling this up, I'm actually glad you asked this because part of what we'd like to do is use this as a common practice. So, on a periodic basis as we meet, I think it would be helpful for us to look at this document and make sure we're clear on what has already been provided, and if there's any additional updates that need to be added so that we maintain that, and it really will be used as a working document. That's our intent for this. So I'm opening it now. All right. So as we said, this really is a point in time update on the various requests. We've received requests from the Commission, the Steering Committee, and the Education Finance Subcommittee, which are noted in here. We will continue to provide updates. Where we could, we built in links so that you could reference those specific reports. So there was do you want me to walk through each of the rows to give you an update, or how do you want to manage this portion of the agenda, Emily? You're on mute, but.
I think I'm also ready for Thanksgiving break. Sorry for everyone who's gonna, please bear with me today. How many rows are we talking about?
It's a lot. So it's a lot. So how about this? I'll run through high level, and then if there are things that you feel like are missing. All right, so we had a request for the budget analysis for long-term ADM back to 2014. So we have provided that information, and there's a data source that was included as well. The expenditures, I think a lot of this is related to, I would say a lot of these requests are related to looking at analysis by a long-term ADM and also by isolating the ed fund. And so you're seeing in the re-release of the state profile report, a lot of that has been included along with from today's presentation. So you'll see that will be noted there. Again, the expenditures by object and function code, we just walked through that with the subcommittee today. There was a request for the district budgets. And so, Mike, I know you had mentioned that again on our call today. So this is something we're working towards. Again, we were able to pull out some high-level trends in the re-release of the state profile report, and I think there's value in diving a little bit deeper into that. So I would say that has been kind of initiated, and there'll be more to come. Again, object and function code. So I think there's a couple areas where the committee has indicated they will refine their request. And so that's noted here in this request of by object and function code show the scale within school districts budgets by spending quartile. So we have already provided an analysis of how size of the supervisory union district correlate with spending. We've also provided that analysis by need of supervisory unions and districts. So I think this may be an area where we want to pause and make sure that we're clear on what the committee is seeking with this request.
I think the idea is that we want to understand sort of by groupings of spending. So, high, medium, low spending districts, and what that correlates to. And so when I say spending quartile, I mean high, medium, low, and low. But it could be quintiles. I don't care if it's 6 units or 3 units, but just grouping out by, and I think it's probably best to look at how the data curves and where it breaks in order to decide if it should be quartiles or quintiles or whatever. But to understand the types of spending behaviors and the types of the attributes of districts that are spending in that particular way.
Got it.
Are those districts spending, while the average amount spent on instruction doesn't seem to have changed, is the amount spent on instruction in high spending districts changing, but the amount in low spending districts is not changing? Just.
So one, I appreciate that you're allowing the analysis to drive how the groupings work, right? And I think that's a really important part of this. It might end up being that it's appropriate to look at it by quartiles. It might be quintiles. It just depends on kind of how the data falls. We have started doing analysis of spending, and we've looked at 4 categories. That was included in the matrix that we have in our state profile report. And I think what I'm hearing from you is trying to understand, are there patterns? So are higher spending districts investing in different things than lower spending districts? Is that the root of your question?
That is one of the roots of my question. And are there spending patterns different? Yes, that's important. Also, other things that we can understand about those districts. Do those districts have demographic attributes? Do they have geographic attributes?
Yeah.
So both how do they behave and who are they, I guess is what I would say.
Yeah. And so one of the things we saw certainly at a high level in terms of trends is when we did the matrix, we compared size, need, spending, and performance. And you're certainly seeing some of our highest needs supervisory unions tend to be lower spending. And so those questions are, well, what are the different patterns within that? So we've done this at a high level. I think we'll need to take that back and understand what else we can surface from that analysis. And I'm just noting that it's related to how the spending patterns might differ and what are some of the geographic and demographic attributes.
And so another way that I would describe that question is the first presentation we looked at, where we saw that the object, like the percentage of spending by each object code, has not actually changed very much over time. Mm-hmm. So that's true on average. I want to understand, did in fact spending go up considerably the amount of share taken up by an object code go up significantly in one grouping and go down considerably in another grouping. And so it came out to be an average, but in fact, what we're seeing is a big splitting in how districts are behaving.
Yeah. The only thing I would also caution in terms of that analysis is how far back we go. So one thing that Amanda had mentioned is there's a big point of caution as we look at this data prior to 2020, because we weren't using the Uniform Charter of Accounts, and also there's some other pre-pandemic indicators that would be noted. So that would just be something I would think would need to be made aware of that, and it would seem that this type of work would need to be more isolated on recent years.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We also had different districts in those years, and so analyzing the district becomes a data matching nightmare. And I don't, since no one said this out loud yet, I just sort of want to name that on some level, we are all here because of things that have evolved over the course of the last 30 years. We're also all here because there was essentially a single year massive spike that we are not looking at, right? Because we can't yet because the numbers aren't available. And so there is no, despite very best efforts, we're going to have a disconnect there in what we're trying to understand until that data is available. And that's through no fault of anyone here. I just sort of want to name that reality that we're coping with.
And I think with that reality, again, it's kind of prioritizing time, right? So there's kind of deeper analysis that can be done with these prior years, or is it spending the time to really get the data validated from fiscal year 24, right? And so those are things that, as I come back to the committee, I just need to really think about how to prioritize that to, drive the decision making. I think, Nicole, you had a question on this particular data request.
It was more of a point in that I think the breaking out by object and function by spending can be also helpful in terms of size. So it may be that we have districts in the state where a large percentage of their operating budget is tuition, in fact, and not operating expenses. And so that may be a function of how much they spend, but it could also be a function of their size and relative. I mean, one of the cases made for our tuitioning system is because we don't have population centers in some of these smaller districts, and we don't have enough students to support public schools or just having a school in every community. And so I think that's an important layer to understand. And I also just wanted to make the point that while the Uniform Chart of Accounts wasn't in place before 2020, Elizabeth and I have talked about this, business managers have used those large, if you start to slice and dice the object and function codes into the more granular level, that's a problem. But what was presented today at the 100 levels and the 1,000 levels generally have been consistently used. So it's not, I just want to make, it's not as though the data is useless or not, they're not useful. And I do think it continues to be important to be looking at factors like Act 46 implementation, the pandemic, and looking at that longer time span does help us start to unpack exactly what's happened over the last decade, because that will inform the policy directions that we take or recommend.
Okay. Elizabeth, go ahead.
I was just going to add a little bit to what Nicole was talking about, and going back to even her observation on one of the slides of the FY17 year as compared to like FY23 and where we are and how those kind of go up and down. Just overall, without seeing the data before, this wouldn't have been apparent. So there again, I'm very thankful for the data that's been shared. This is really, really helpful. But I think it is key to think about when a lot of those consolidations may have happened, voluntary or whatever. I know my district did consolidate in FY18. And then as you look down that chart, looking at expenditures for FY20 and 21, those are your COVID years, the first couple of years there where there was an influx of more federal revenue and so less dependency upon the general operating or ed fund. And then I agree, if you look at 17 to 23 and you compare overall spending from the ed fund, it only increases by 1.2%. which indicates that during that span of time and all of those things that happened, it's, the increase as a percentage overall is really not that surprising and large. And there again, we don't see 24 in here. And so I think that's, to Emily's point, that 24 is a spike year and maybe even 25 budgets being even higher, that's going to be really telling. But we wouldn't have even been able to see that on a presentation if we didn't have the data. So just really appreciating that, but also just calling out that the trend during that period of time is not alarming. It's what happens after 23.
So thank you for that. And I think it's important, like the data is doing, these presentations are doing what we need them to do, right? It tells us something that's important, but it also identifies other questions that we need to explore. And I think to what you're touching on, Elizabeth, is that there's this shift to fiscal year 24 and 25 is showing that there was a lot of reliance on this infusion of federal dollars, right? And that becoming very challenging. One of the things that I wanted to just bring up on the screen and point your attention to when you have time to go deeper into the state profile report is we've started to look at, and I'm bringing it up now, some of these categories. So I just wanted you, this is just one beginning way to start looking at how we can map these various components in a way that tell a broader story. And so, of course, this is looking at fiscal year 23 data, so keep that in mind. But it is, I think, a helpful illustration of how we could start to slice and dice the information in ways that can be meaningful. So, you know, this is, again, as we orient you to this chart, the actual size of the circle is representing the size of the supervisory union or district. The color of the circle is representing need. So the red and orange are representing higher need as relation to free and reduced lunch, and the green is representing lower need. And then the quadrants have been organized by spending and also performance. So this is an attempt for us to begin to explore how all of these variables intersect. And we've talked about doing this with other data points, also looking at staffing, looking at teacher salaries. Like there's a number of different things that could be mapped on where we start to understand the patterns of size and need and performance related to other variables that we know are important to driving student outcomes. So just share that because it's kind of an initial way to start looking at this, and we can add to that and refine. And I also, I know we've talked a lot about maps. I just wanted you to be aware too that within the re-released report, we have a map of just public school enrollment. We also have a map of the 4-year change with enrollment. And then we have another map that's looking at average daily membership as well. And so that's also representing those students that go to public school and may go to independent schools. What we're working on now is another map that's really showing, again, the complexity and interdependence of our system and showing the being able to represent the districts that are fully operating districts, those that are fully tuitioned, and those that are a mix, right? And I think that's also helpful as we start to think about our overall education ecosystem. And so that will be coming as well. And then you can see within the maps the representation of free and reduced lunch and how that varies across the state, along with special education as well, and English learners in the state. So I just wanted to share that. Yep.
I have 2 quick clarifying questions. One, when you reference free and reduced lunch in the context of all this data, are you talking about the expanded eligibility for free and reduced lunch that includes the matched Medicaid data, or are you talking about families that actually filled out that piece of paperwork?
Yeah, so it's a really important question, and it's something that we addressed in the memo that I provided to the commission. When we're looking at free and reduced lunch, we've worked with our internal experts at the agency to figure out how to best represent that. And so in many instances, you're seeing an average of free and reduced lunch to create that stabilization of that metric of poverty. We, moving forward, and this is certainly part of the new weights, will be the Medicaid certification. We are not able at this time to recreate that analysis in the rear because we didn't collect that as part of our budgeting process before. So that is something moving into the future that I think will be helpful and potentially a more stable metric of poverty.
Thanks. And then my other clarifying question, and this might be a way bigger answer than we have time for, so just let me know. In understanding student performance, which is something that is very outside of my policy bailiwick, I've usually seen like very specific cut points used, like third grade or high school graduation. And I noticed in there that you had sort of an expanded one, and I'm just curious about the choices about that.
Yep. So again, that's one representation of how we start to triangulate all these different data points. What's included in that is overall proficiency rates for English language, arts, and math. We certainly can look at that in relation to specific metrics around third grade reading and graduation rate. There's a lot of data that we pulled in the report that goes into that level, but we were at this for that particular view was looking at proficiency. We're very interested also in measuring growth. Other states focus more on growth than our accountability system. And so that's some feedback we've been receiving through the Listen and Learn tour as we contemplate changes to or amendments to our state plan is how do we account for growth more prominently as we're measuring performance of our students.
Thanks. And I would just personally love offline love advice from other members who know a lot more about this than I do if we're going to be talking about quality in the context of these conversations, where I could learn more about how to understand those metrics. So thank you, Zoe, very much.
I didn't know if you wanted me to go back to the overview. There's a lot of different rows, but I think maybe what I would suggest, because it is pretty comprehensive, if you could take time as committee members to review that. There are a couple of areas where we noted that we might need some more refinement from the committee. So in those areas, if you have specific feedback or follow-up, please send it my way. In other areas, you'll note that we've linked to specific reports that I think would be helpful. So getting into other areas like provisional licensing and staffing, there's some links in there as well that we haven't had a chance yet to talk about as a committee. So I would look at that and then just send my way where you feel you'd like to focus in or for us to present more in a subsequent meeting.
So thank you. So I would like to sort of make that an official assignment for everyone here that we will all dive deep into that spreadsheet and also read the updated state profile report in preparation for our next meeting. I would particularly ask people to look at the updated policy lever document that Mike sent around and that's posted today, and use that as a reference point for that list of data requests to see if policy decisions were going to be made about those policy levers, what data would we need to understand that? And so we could even add an extra column if we wanted to that policy lever document. And so then I think that would be a great step forward in getting clear on what we're all doing here. So thank you. Okay, with that, we are going to take a break and we will be back here at 11:30. Welcome back. I hope everyone stood up from their desks. So next up on the agenda, we were going to talk about the dynamics fundamentals of foundation formula with Justin. Really appreciate it. I just want to say foundation formulas have changed since Vermont had one. There's a lot to be learned in what's happened in America in the last 30 years, and I'm grateful that you're able to join us, Justin, and take us through some of that.
Perfect. To your questions, one, can folks hear me?
We can,
Perfect.
though we are
Good.
having a profoundly glitchy day here on Teams, and
I've been listening along, so I'm assuming I'll have some problem at some point. So, which could include a dog barking from upstairs. So, little things that we'll go with. So, wanted to walk through and really appreciate the opportunity to come talk about foundation formulas. Had wanted to start with a set of kind of just finance terms that I might use throughout the presentation to kind of level set. I think this is even more important after some of the earlier public comment around foundation formulas. And I think to your point, like how they change, what they really mean. And so I'll try to dig into each of those pieces. But a couple of kind of key school finance terms that we'll use. And the first couple of slides really will be kind of school finance 101. So I apologize. But none of this is like textbook level. The main concept in school finance that folks talk a lot about is equity. And equity really over time has been broken down into 3 different ways to analyze equity. One is horizontal equity. Way back when, that really just meant, does every student get the same amount of dollars, right? That went out the door decades ago. We started to think about horizontal equity more. Does a district or student that is similar to another district or student receive the same treatment? And when I say treatment here, mostly I'm going to talk about, do they have the same level of resource available to them for their education? Vertical equity is really, in my opinion, the most important analysis of equity currently, which is to say, are differences treated differently? So if you have a district, or more importantly, probably a student who has higher needs, do they have higher resources available to them to create a similar educational opportunity? And then you also, moving away from kind of the student-centric or district-centric approach, you have taxpayer equity. And at some level, that really is, in order to participate in the state's funding system, do taxpayers really have to put up a similar effort, right? So you don't want to see wide variation in taxpayer effort to get kind of the same thing out of the system. So that would be taxpayer equity. We'll get into each of these a little bit more in the slides below.
Just a clarifying question. I'm sorry. So under vertical equity, should it be receive additional resources or require additional resources?
Well, so the concept is that they require them. So as we measure equity, we will want to see that they receive them. So to your point, yeah, absolutely. Fiscal neutrality really at its basis is where a student lives shouldn't determine the resources available to them. And that generally means looking at the level of resource per pupil and whatever your measure of wealth of a community is, and making sure there isn't a strong correlation between the two. You don't want to see the highest amount of resources in the places with the highest wealth, right? You don't want to see that strong correlation. And then at the kind of the more recent kind of school finance term, and what a lot of states have turned to, is this concept of adequacy. And adequacy was really developed in the late 90s as part of kind of the standard-based reform movement. So states decided they started to set the standards of what they wanted students to know. They created tests to measure how well students were meeting that. They created accountability systems to hold really schools, at that time, schools and districts accountable for how well they were meeting them. And the question just kind of got out there, which is, well, if we know what we want them to learn, we can measure how well they're doing it, we're holding them accountable. Should we also be really considering the question of how much it costs to get that done? So that's really what adequacy is. It's not a minimum amount. It really is a targeted amount to ensure that students can meet state expectations and standards. And then the next piece for us is really important, I think really goes into some of the earlier comments, is that we at APA really think of two key parts of a school finance formula. The first is the determination of how much. So states generally have some sort of formula to say, we believe this is the amount of funding that a district needs based on their student or district characteristics. And so that is their funding formula. It could also include, and we'll look at it, some categorical funding or some other pieces, but they are the state is setting the how much within the state formula. And then the second piece is the who pays for it. How is that paid for? And really a piece I don't have on there, can locals raise additional dollars? And a lot of the equity concerns and some of those concerns that were brought up about the Pennsylvania piece is that additional amount of funding that can happen, or the disconnect between how much the state said should be funded and who's paying for it. And so an example would be, and I don't have it here, but we can send it to you, some work we did in Utah. The most equitable states are the states whose formula define the vast majority of funding in the system, and there's very little that can happen beyond that formula. So there could be some local additional dollars, but not a lot of local additional dollars. And so it's less about how you determine how much and much more about how defined you are in controlling the overall additional dollars outside the system. So it's clear that in Vermont, this kind of step one and step two have been combined and are starting to, they work together. So there is not really an explicit approach to step one. We don't define within the state, here's how much each district should be spending within the state formula. It's more about a capacity to raise dollars. And then, of course, funding itself is a state funding system, with the majority of that funding coming from property taxes. And so as states change their formulas, there's kind of four main things they're looking at. One is they're really trying to determine what is kind of the educational opportunity or outcomes they want for students, and they want to ensure that they're providing a similar opportunity across the state. A lot of these formulas are becoming much more student-centric. And when we say that, really what they're becoming is they're really being responsive to that vertical equity. They believe that there's higher resource needs, and thus there need to be more dollars going to districts with more economically disadvantaged students, more EL students, more special education students, and they're designing systems to do that. A number of states are actually starting to tie those dollars to not just to the district or the SUSD, to the school. And so they're saying, if we are going to provide additional funding for EL students, we want to see some percentage of those funds at least go to the school where that student is. And then, of course, states are also adjusting for those district cost drivers that are outside of district control. And we'll get a little bit more into those. So there's this concept of like formula names and what are the types of formulas used across the country. I went ahead and I turned to the Education Commission of the States. They spend a lot of time looking at who's doing what. They identify four big buckets. 36 states they identify using a foundation formula, and I'm going to come back to that line here in a second. 9 states they identify as using a resource-based formula. That's mostly southern states, and when we say a resource-based formula, literally the formula says, well, if you have, for every 25 kids, we're going to give you a teacher. For every 300 kids, we're going to give you a counselor, right? They build up their funding by mostly ratios, and then they create a funding system, and that, again, mostly southern states, mostly county-based systems. There are 4 states who use a hybrid approach, including 2 of your kind of regional neighbors, Massachusetts and Maine. And then there are 2 other, and you are one of the other. I believe the other state is Wisconsin, which again also is more tax-based. It's kind of a tax-based system versus a resource, like a specific resource-based system. Going back up to the foundation formulas, giving you a couple examples regionally, New Hampshire, New York, and Connecticut all use foundation formulas. I think what's important here is they all have very different parts of that second step. So they're using a foundation formula, they're setting a base, they have weights, but the how it's paid for and then how much additional dollars can be generated locally are different in all 3 of those states. And it's that second piece that can really cause some of the big equity concerns. And hopefully no one is, big fan of New Hampshire's finance system. New Hampshire generally considered like the least equitable system in the country. They have a strong foundation formula on its kind of design, but they allow their systems. Two foundation formulas are Tennessee, Nevada, and Maryland. Again, all three have slightly different ways of then who pays for it or how many additional dollars can be raised outside of the foundation formula. A quick, just kind of overview of kind of that 30,000 very generic version of what does a state look like if they're using a foundation formula. They are going to drive most of their dollars through the base or foundation funding. They are then going to have student weights and district weights. Generally, actually, that student weight block should be, in best practice, bigger than your district weight block, right? So you're going to have more additional dollars above base going out for your student need than your district need. And ideally, that foundation formula is going to drive a huge chunk of the dollars going out to districts. You still, of course, are going to have federal funds. You are still, of course, going to have categorical or grant funding. And a number of states provide their special ed through categorical. They don't put it through the weights. And then there's this piece of what there's going to be 1,000 names for it, local option funding or mill levy overrides. But this is the additional funding that locals can raise. And we'll talk a little bit more about kind of what that looks like and what some of the concerns are there. And so with the foundation formula, really the most important piece is the base or foundation amount. So it represents what a student with no identifiable needs in a district with no identified additional cost drivers should expect to receive as a resource level. And then above that, you want to adjust for those student characteristic differences. And so some of the key and most frequently used are economically disadvantaged students, English learners, and special education. Some states with their economically disadvantaged students have a weight plus a concentration factor. English learners, you might do it differential on your WIDA level. Number of states have multiple weights for special ed, right? So there's other things you can do within those blocks, but generally those are the three key blocks. And then some of the district characteristic adjustments that are made. 13 states use cost of living or cost of doing business differences. So it's not by any means the majority. It's not even the majority of foundation formulas. A lot of states do some differential for either district size or kind of what we would call necessarily small settings. And this came up earlier, right? Like places where you have to have the school or the district because it's just impossible really to get kids other places. A lot of states will make adjustments for that. States will also make adjustments for district size. If the state says, well, you district, you exist, this is our governance structure and you're a lot smaller, we know there's generally an economies of scale issue there and you'll have some adjustment for resource there. So this is the second piece, this next slide. And I think this is where, again, Pennsylvania had some issues. I think probably even for Vermont, this is kind of where the issue came up is the who pays for it and what additional funds can be raised above it. A lot of states use a foundation formula, use what we call an equalization formula to then figure out who pays for it. And all really that is happening there is you're focused on taxpayer equity. And what you're basically doing is saying, we as a state in the first phase will determine how much each district needs. We will then ask every community to have the same mill rate to participate. The first dollars will be the local dollars, and then the state will backfill the rest. And so if you are a high property, and I say property wealth, but however you measure wealth, some states also use income. If you're a high wealth district, you're going to pay locally more of that state formula. If you're low wealth, you're going to pay less. But you're all going to pay the same rate, right? That's kind of a very classic, perfectly equalized formula. So the next couple slides switch into some.
Can I ask a question? Yeah. So I've been thinking about and we've actually been structuring a lot of our work around sort of the spending side and the raising side, right? Yeah. And I guess I'm curious, like, is there a way that the raising side of a foundation formula has to work? I've always sort of understood it more as like the foundation formula is about sort of how the money is driven to districts for spending. And I'd love to just add a little more, if you could add a little more context to that.
No, I think you're exactly right. I think to me, the foundation formula is the how much, just to your point. That's actually what the foundation formula does, or what the resource-based formulas do, or what the hybrid formulas do. The other piece is really a tax policy conversation and an equity conversation about additional dollars. And so every state who uses a foundation formula has some approach to determine kind of state-local split, which of course in Vermont is less of a thing, right? You're going to really just be determining kind of tax rates and how to generate the dollars. But to me, that's not really a foundation formula, right? That's in many states an equalization formula, right? So you move from the how do you determine how much to trying to figure out what's the right way to raise those dollars in an equitable manner for taxpayers. And so
And
just
I'm sorry, I'll just add, my previous superintendency was in Pennsylvania, so I fully understand the issues there, and that's the issue. The local share is where there's an equity.
Yeah,
and I can talk about that for an hour, but there are many issues there that are different than Vermont.
Yeah, and then, full disclosure, our company is the one who did the adequacy study back in 2006. We didn't end up being part of the lawsuit, but we're definitely, in that work throughout those couple of years, and so really understand a lot of those issues. But I think this is where the Vermont context really starts to come into play. And so first, just really quickly, with Act 127, and even before that, you have a history of thinking about student weights and differentiating for student need, right? That's a key component of a foundation formula. I think where the disconnect has happened is that there is no base to drive those weights. There's no setting of what should be in every place. And the way I think about it is if you had two districts who have the exact same student, demographics and size, right now the formula isn't saying, well, you would expect both of them to, within the state formula, kind of have the same level of resource, right? That's a local decision that's being made. It's not being driven by your weights. You also, again, are fully funded statewide. And I have a last bullet point, which is, Brigham, right? We have to figure out where that works in. But having state funding should help think through some of the equity issues. But you do already recognize that and again, there's a lot of things that happen as you set tax rates in the state. And so I will totally step on, put my foot in my mouth as I talk about it. But on average, if you had two districts with the exact same wealth and they want to spend different amounts of money per weighted student, they should have different tax rates to do that even currently, right? You look at that equalization to get that done. And so you allow spending differences, but there is some reflection on if you wanted to spend more or less, there should be some different tax rates there. And so the next couple slides think about just very 15,000 foot, how could you implement a foundation formula in Vermont? So the first thing is you absolutely have weights through Act 127 and a recent history of using them, but you don't have a base that they're applied to. And so I'm going to kind of actually start with the second bullet first here, the big bullet. The first thing you need to do is think about what's the base? What is everything going to drive from and how do you set that? And then you should evaluate your current weights to make sure they're generating the dollars that are needed for students in those categories. And so, for example, we're going to have a Colorado report released in January, and we definitely talk about a weight for what we call at-risk, you call economically disadvantaged students. But what we talk about very clearly is it's a per pupil amount of money divided by a base amount that generates that weight. And so if the base amount were lower or higher, that weight would be lower or higher, but it would be focused on generating an amount of resource for a kid. Right now, that doesn't explicitly exist in Vermont's formula. And to set that base amount, let's just be honest, a lot of states say, well, here's how much money we have to spend. Here's what we think our weight should be. We can run a reverse math formula, and we can create a foundation formula to only distribute the amount of money we want to spend. That wouldn't really be best practice, right? Best practice is trying to think about how much should it be, both base and weights. Bunch of different adequacy approaches. Larry Pikus presented to you all a couple weeks ago. He presented one of the approaches, which is the evidence base. There are 4 approaches that have been kind of used. A lot of states use 2 of these, and you all have kind of done 2 of them at this point, so let's talk through that. The first bucket approaches are input-based approaches. That's evidence-based or something called professional judgment. What's really the kind of pros of both of those is they tell you the how, the what, right? How many teachers, how many principals, how many counselors, and you build that up. And for Larry's approach right now, as someone mentioned, it's 400 students. You know, it's kind of these average schools of 400 students, which don't quite look like Vermont. You can also, professional judgment, built more panels, but looks at a lot of different sizes. But both of them tend to also work with state educators. So one of the things that I don't think's happened with evidence-based yet, which usually does, is you have some statewide review panels where folks from Vermont say, hey, wait, contextually, here's some things that would have to be different to actually work in this state. That could include thinking about size. You have also done one of the two output approaches, which is how you set your Act 127 weights, right? The work done by Tammy and Bruce Baker and AIR, that group, was a cost function approach. Often from a cost function approach, you will not only get the weights, you would get a base. So I think that's one thing you could look at to see, was there a base that was driving those weights explicitly? I've read the report through one extra time. It could be sitting there, and I apologize if I just missed it. But you know, that's there. The other approach is something called the school successful school districts, which basically says, go find your districts who are outperforming other districts, look at what they spend at a base level. You can't look at your economically disadvantaged or those other spending in this approach. What's really good about those output-based approaches is they can target specific levels of outcomes, and they're really data-driven, and there's a lot of folks who like that, right? But that's one of the reasons using two of them together, an output and an input approach, and kind of melding those results, I think is somewhat best practice. Almost done, promise last slide. Again, you currently allow for variations in per pupil spending across the state. A lot of foundation formulas also do that. And again, there's 1,000 names for it. I called it, I think, local options before. Others just call it local mills. This is where your equity issues will be most pronounced if you move to a foundation formula and allow these additional local options. And they come in two ways. The first is, how much additional local do you allow? Is it unlimited? There are states, I think North Carolina is one of those states where they just said, the Supreme Court said, the state's going to say how much is needed, and then locals can raise anything they want above that, and that's constitutionally okay. I don't think that is okay in Vermont. Again, I'm not a lawyer. You're going to hear from someone else who will say that better. My gut is that's not okay. So you could work to say, is it 5% more? Is it 10% more? You know, is there some cap that you would allow additional? And then the second piece is, do you equalize those additional mills at least at some level? If you don't, and a lot of states don't, you are going to have places who can raise a bunch of more additional dollars on very low tax rates. So you're going to impact your fiscal neutrality and your taxpayer equity really fast. But what a number of states do is they say, well, we're not going to fully equalize, but we're going to make sure that any community who goes out for additional dollars has, let's say, at least the median, they're generating dollars at least the median wealth of the state, right? So if you have really low wealth, the state's going to backfill a lot of that. If you're above the median wealth, the state's going to give you nothing, but you're going to work somewhat to make that more equitable. And again, I think it's a huge piece with Brigham and others of, can you do any of it? Should you do any of it? But it is a place, you know, that's important, I think, to have, but really is where a lot of your equity issues will come into play. And that is it. And I remember to put my question slide. Just making fun of Amanda a little bit. Sorry.
Thanks, Justin.
No problem.
I'm curious if there, you know, you talked about a state that sort of set its foundation by just dividing how much money they thought they had available. And you've talked about sort of a mathematically driven approach. Are there best practices for how states stick to their mathematically driven approach in tough financial times?
Yes. And I would say one, no state has solved that problem, right? Unless historically there was a handful of states who had huge mineral wealth and they could solve that problem because they just had huge mineral wealth. And so you were fine. I think one of the ways is to try to link your base to some sort of cost adjustment factor year to year, right? So we call it, use a CPI, whatever it is, and say, we are going to at least guarantee it goes up by CPI each year. And when you have a foundation formula, right, all the weights drive off the base. So as long as the base is going up, every other factor will go up. So that's the right approach, but it still doesn't solve for the fact that in some years that could be more money than you think you have, right? That's just a fundamental problem. And I think, that's always going to be a problem. I think no matter what formula you put in place, no matter what way you look at this, like that's an underlying issue. I would also say review, having in statute, if you put in a new formula, a review every 5 to 10 years, especially of the weights, is really important, right? Because we know more about EL weights today. And I actually, I've seen Tammy's, kind of recent report, right? We know more about EL weights today than we did 5 years ago. We know a whole lot more about them than we did 15 years ago, right? And we'll probably know more about them in another 10 years. You mentioned that we're switching in many states how we count economically disadvantaged students. As we do that, we should be thoughtful about the weights. Nevada, for example, is counting a third of the economically disadvantaged students they used to count, but using the same weight. That seems like a bit of a disconnect, right? Like you generated the thought of how much more was needed on this definition. You switched your definition, but now you're kind of funding the same amount per pupil, which means the overall funding went down dramatically, right? So just being really thoughtful of if there's a change in your standard, if there's a change in, count or anything like that, like open up the system and look at what you're doing again.
And are there governance best practices beyond sort of putting it in statute and putting it in inflator? Determinations by a state board of ed versus determinations by a department of ed versus determinations by a legislature or something.
Amanda's on here and I'm going to turn to her too. She's always far smarter than I am, but not on average, right? I think the two things I would say, and just reiterate, the more dollars that are defined by your finance system, be it a foundation formula or categoricals or whatever it is, the higher percentage of those dollars, the more equitable your system is likely to be, right? So I think that's going to be best practice no matter what. And then I think having folks come together, right? A lot of states will have the legislature, and legislature give the agency, legislature say, we want to look at the weights, agency, you run that study and bring it back to us, right? So you have multiple people in the conversation. I think that's always a good practice versus having kind of silos and battles when you do some of this.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. I think to me, the best practice is less around the who, but the how often. Because there's plenty of formulas that get put in place that get very stagnant. And Nevada recently redid theirs after not touching it for 40 years. So it's the frequency of looking at it. I think that is the biggest piece of the puzzle.
Nicole?
Thanks. First, I just need to say this has been a really full circle meeting for me. I am I'm in Pennsylvania right now, but I interned for the Education Law Center when I was in law school and was part of the advocacy around the adequacy study in Pennsylvania. So, whoa! I'm interested in transition. And, when you think about the legislature initiating a process to establish a base amount, and so much of the conversation, we're a subcommittee of a larger commission that's been looking at questions around scale, delivery, governance. So it's multi-layered. And I think the consensus is that just changing the funding formula is insufficient. And so I'm wondering if, and I'm not sure there are many examples we could draw from to support, but sort of what would a sequencing or timeline look like? A fear I have is we get into this next legislative session and we rewrite the funding formula, which may very well be what we need to do as a state, but we sort of lose sight of the other issues that need to be addressed and how they need to be sequenced in order to arrive in an equitable place.
Yeah, and that's I don't think we can tell you like exact terms right there, but I totally agree. I think as you're modeling and thinking through changes to a formula, whatever you land on, trying to think through governance at the same time is really important because it will change your cost structures. It will change how perhaps you design the system, right? If you have as many small places as you have now, you probably have to be very, very hyper focused on some of those adjustments for those circumstances versus if you're moving towards something different, perhaps you still need to have it in the short term, but it's not as much of the long-term focus. And so I think, am I back? All right, sorry. My internet just decided to drop. It's perfect Monday. I think a lot of states have made the determination that having a well-defined formula where we really know base and we really know the weights is the most important first step. And so like a Tennessee, that's what they made that choice, right? Mississippi just did the same sort of thing. Like that's what was most important to them. And so that's kind of the sequencing question, which is it could be that you go for something early on knowing it will be more expensive than it will be 3 to 4 years from now as you start to move through your governance, but you would have to put that on the table, right? And this is what I always say, like being able to say things out loud at the front end and codifying, but just saying it out loud. Yes, we want to do X because we think it's important for taxpayers and students, and we know this isn't where we're going to end, but we think this is the most important first step because it makes the biggest change for everyone. But hey, these are the other things we will be doing is really important because, we live in a state like in Colorado who went to go change their formula and it just cost a lot of districts a lot of money. And so the formula is not really any different. It's like a little bit better, but folks just were unwilling to say like this could have like these impacts over time. And some of them will be negative for folks, right? But it's what's best for all students and for the state longest term.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate this. And this is clearly the beginning of a conversation. Zoe, go ahead.
Thanks. I think what Nicole was, mentioning is really at the core of what we're grappling with, right? That there is tremendous complexity to this work, and it's not just about one input. But so one input and one change has a lot of other ripple effects on our system. And so one of the things I would wonder if you could expand on is how states go about at the front end establishing very clear goals of what they're trying to achieve, and how they move forward in outlining the assumptions, right? Because I think that's really important as you were talking about the different methodology to building a foundation formula. There are very specific assumptions that are put into place either around how staffing is organized, the scale, quality measures. So how do states do that work at the front end of being really intentional and strategic around setting those specific goals? Have you seen good models of that we could reference?
Yeah, and again, Amanda, pick up where I don't fill it in. I think the first key step is really being to define what you're trying to ensure students can achieve. And so the old school approach of here's how many dollars you have and let's back map math really is just saying we're probably going to get our current state, but we're going to, in part because we're going to spend what we currently have within the governance structure we currently live in. So having some really defined goals about what you're trying to get for students. And so some of that could be at the most micro level, like here is the minimum educational kind of opportunity or we would want in a school in the state, right? And so that's more of a governance question. And I think really saying like, we also agree on what our outcome goals are. And we know, having done some of the listen and learn work, right, that's not all test scores, right? There's a whole set of things that make up outcomes. And so really trying to first, in part, think about what are we trying to get to for kids? What are we trying to ensure they have? That then I think, Nicole, to your point, kind of breeds off both under the current system, it might cost X, but if we were refining our governance structure to better meet that and make that more efficient and effective, it might cost something different, right? And we might design our formula a little bit. And so you probably have some parallel or multiple parallel tracks that you would need to go down. But overall, I think it's getting consensus on what is the change you're actually trying to get to? Is it just a finance change? Is it just a governance change, or it really is a outcomes change for kids being fed by? And my last soapbox thing will be a lot of states are trying to use finance as the way to improve their education systems versus defining what improvement means for their education system and building a finance system that supports that. So that's the best practice, but it's way harder to do, right? It takes a lot of really strong conversations.
And I was just going to add the piece you were touching on, Justin, the what does it look like now versus where are we trying to go in the future? A lot of states are thinking as they redesign funding formulas, what can they do now and it could be what dollars do we have available? And then what are our targets for the future, for that future level of performance and educational opportunities for our students? What does that look like? And then they might have a 10-year plan to get between where they are now to there. And the other thing, as you think about a foundation formula, is that balance between the base and the weights is another conversation places have. Like, do you get fully the structure you want into place? So your base might be lower than you think, but you have that differential relationship with the needs that you want to have. Do you put more dollars into the base and then grow your weights over time? So there's different ways states think about that and different ways they think about how to make those decisions. So when Nevada was looking at this work and starting with, they have both pieces of the puzzle, kind of what did they have now? Where were they going in the future? What did they want to balance between the base and the weights? Was really also around stakeholder engagement and getting the sense from the field and the community, which approach best met their state's needs and the needs of their stakeholders. So just what I would add there.
Thank you. So of course, this is just the beginning of the conversation, and there are so many pieces that need to be taken into account, including sort of the critiques I've seen of PICUS's work are usually about how it's inflationary, but in fact, in Vermont, it would be less money if we applied it directly. Similarly, I think a move to a foundation formula is often about having more money spent by the state on education. And we are looking at this as a way to sort of make more consistent the way we're spending on money on education and perhaps less. And so I think that's, there are quite a few ways that we're sort of differing from some other transitions that states have done that I think we're going to need to taking into account. And then one of the biggest ones is Brigham. So would love to move to that portion of the conversation. I think Emily is with us somewhere inside this. There she is. And just want to say, so I imagine most of us have had a conversation about this before in some place, or a conversation about Brigham in some place. Attorneys differ on their interpretations of Supreme Court decisions. And I was actually thinking it'd be super fun if we got like a bunch of attorneys to all discuss the case with each other and we could just listen. But remarkably few attorneys with experience in this are interested in coming to join us for this conversation. And so if you happen to know attorneys that would think it would be really fun to like be on that kind of roundtable, please let me know, because I'd like to set one up. And in the meantime, we have Emily Simmons here to join us to give the Agency of Education's interpretation of how the foundation formula and Brigham fit with each other. Take it away, Emily.
Thank you. I'm so excited to hear that I represent a quorum of the willing today, the week of Thanksgiving break. No, I'm excited to have this conversation. And I think we should all think of it together as the second, actually, in many conversations. And you're not going to get one answer at one point in time, right? So everybody here has, I know, a familiarity with Brigham. So I hope that I can lay out some markers that enable you to have a discussion, and that I can help provide information to that discussion and get you going. So I provided a slideshow at the first meeting of the full commission. I'm not going to present that again today. Emily, you were the only one who wasn't there, and I know that you know the basics of the decision. So I have that handy if anybody wants me to refer back to it, but I'm assuming that we all have that base level of knowledge of the decision. I wanted to start off by reminding you that the court's decision in Brigham was a ruling on a set of facts, right? And so a lot of the ways I answer your questions today are going to point you back to considerations or principles that we might find to be predictive in any future ruling. But baseline, we all need to understand that we will have a different set of facts in any future challenge. And so we can expect an outcome that's tailored to those facts, right? So are you hearing me say loud and clear, the devil is in the details? Because that's the theme here. One consideration is that Brigham included plaintiffs that were both representative of student equity concerns and taxpayer equity concerns. And the court did not directly rule on the taxpayers' claims, although many statements in the dicta of the decision can sort of point you towards how they felt about facts that were common to the two claims. The other point I wanted to make following on Justin's presentation, I think really consistent with Justin's presentation, is that right now we're talking about how a Brigham court or the Supreme Court in a follow-up to Brigham, right? So assuming a new formula and assuming a challenge to that formula would view it. And we're talking about a foundation formula today. I really see that as a giant placeholder and hope that everybody else does too, right? If we're talking about the issues, the constitutional issues of a foundation formula, that formula is going to be some combination of many policy choices along the way that we don't have laid out here. I'm sure if we started throwing them out, we wouldn't all have the same ideas of what we're talking about yet. Any responsible policymaking body, so you, the full commission, the General Assembly, will inevitably have legal opinions along the way about the risk of policy considerations that are actively being debated to help inform those actual decisions. We can speak right now in terms of some choices that we might say are easily evaluated under our constitutional framework, and many, I think, that are going to be close questions depending on the exact policy adopted or considered, right? So to get you started in your conversation, one way to summarize Brigham is that it found the then current system of funding failed to provide reasonable educational equity of opportunity. There's a lot of descriptors in that sentence, but we're looking essentially at the marriage of two important concepts: that there is educational opportunity for students, that the state is fulfilling its fundamental obligation to provide educational opportunity to students, and to do so on an reasonably equal basis, right? So that's the marriage of the education clause in our Constitution and the common benefits clause. You have the benefit and you are not infringing on it in an unreasonably unequitable way, or providing it in an unequitable way. The court in Brigham did not give us an exact order of operations to use in the future to determine the constitutionality of future funding systems. They actually declined to state what legal test they were bound to use to evaluate the education clause and the common benefits clause, but they were clear that the state has the burden to, one, not infringe on this fundamental obligation in the education clause, and two, that if any party in the future establishes that that right has been infringed, that the state will bear a high bar of justification for any infringements. And I think we have all forecast, although this is blinking like different lawyers will have different opinions, and one is logging on now. We can forecast that the greater the infringement or the greater the failure to provide the benefit, the heavier justification any court is going to expect the state to have associated with their policy choices that lead to that infringement. Okay, I hope you are generating questions for me, because there's not, without a plan on the table, there's not a lot of upfront information that I can present to you. But again, just having heard the presentation from Justin, I wonder if you have other questions that are popping up for you.
I have sort of a very basic question, and also have the Monday of Thanksgiving week brain. So forgive however this comes out. But the Brigham decision, it seems to me that it wasn't about foundation formulas being unconstitutional, but the way this particular foundation formula played out in communities being unconstitutional. And I just wondered if you could talk through the dynamics of that in a little more detail.
Sure. So As I was reviewing to, present to you all today, it occurred to me, and this is sort of stealing a metaphor, but the problems with Brigham, according to the Supreme Court in that case, were kind of like an onion. So there were obvious ones that were on the outside, and there were facts that the court pointed to that were easy inequities to find. And then there were more nuanced problems that the court discussed, but maybe didn't ultimately hang their hat on. But yeah, to answer your question, Emily, we could go through and we could look at some of those examples, but I can tell you, consistent with my remarks up top, there was not, the court did not dig into the taxing structure, for example, in any great detail to find that the current plan was unconstitutional. The best characterization that I often cite when I present is that the court summarized the current plan as heavily reliant on local revenues, local taxation, and resulting in obvious disparities in student access to opportunity, and that those paired together was sort of a slam dunk for the plaintiffs, you could say.
Go ahead, Nicole.
Thanks. Hi, Emily. So I think for me, the phrase that sticks in my head the most from Brigham is the mere fortuity of a child's residence, right? So access to resources cannot be contingent on where a kid lives. And so when we think about a foundation formula and this question that I think Justin flagged multiple times in the presentation is, to what extent should communities be able to spend above the foundation amount? And that to me seems to be the key Brigham question, is assuming distribution of resources that are weighted. And I wonder whether you can just affirm that that is going to be sort of a central point of tension as we explore options, and or if the case gives any clear guidance around tolerance for how big that band might be.
Right. I agree that, like, at the level where you are all operating, your understanding of current tax policy, likely future tax policy, and the Brigham decision, one's mind does go directly to that central question. I don't want to say that there aren't other questions we could identify, but yes. And anybody that presents to you on those hard and fast policy questions is going to have cautions for you about the treatment of local revenues. That is always going to surface as a issue that a policy body should handle delicately and intentionally. The court did say that absolute equality of funding was not a requirement of our Constitution. I think they were pretty careful in not shading beyond that statement. So I would say we're not held to dollar for dollar equity. And again, pointing to Justin's presentation, understanding of vertical and horizontal equity have really grown in the literature since Brigham. And I think if the court had had those terms to draw on, you would have seen those terms discussed in the decision. And just for everybody's information, I learned about Brigham from Nicole Mace when I was still a law student. So a little bit of a full circle moment for me here as well.
Wow, we are forming so many delightful circles in this room today. Michael.
Well, my question actually perfectly dovetails into this. When we talked about absolute equality of funding, I pulled up the Brigham decision, and one of my questions is in the second half of that one statement. So I'll just read it. It says, "In so holding, we emphasize that absolute equality of funding is neither a necessary nor a practical requirement to satisfy the constitutional command of equal educational opportunity." It's those last three words that I have a question about in your interpretation. I've had a hard time finding a good definition of equal educational opportunity. Now, I didn't have Nicole Mace as a professor, but many, many, many years ago when I had my philosophy education course, this is one of the, I think we spent a whole class talking about equal educational opportunity and what it is. So I'm just curious to see your thoughts of how that relates.
Yeah, I wonder, Mike, if today the court would have substituted equitable for equal. I mean, as a lawyer and not a practitioner, I could get a little lost in do terms go in and out of favor because the pendulum swings, or are we over time actually getting a better definition of what those terms mean? But I know for sure today it is more common to see the word equitable or equity used than equal. So that's one reaction. And the second one is kind of an easy answer to give you. No, I don't. The court did not define the term as part of its holding. Couldn't tell you if they were very wise in knowing that they were not defining that term, or if among the members of the court they all meant the same thing and they knew it and it didn't need to be written out in the decision. I think imagine us in a hypothetical future state when you actually have plaintiffs and a system that is being defended by the state, and what kinds of evidence would the plaintiffs find it persuasive to put on the table to show inequity. In Brigham, there were facts about offerings in schools. There were facts about people's tax bills, right? There were really eye-catching examples of taxes on a home of the same value in two different towns that spent roughly the same on education, and where taxpayers had huge disparities in what they actually paid to support the opportunities in their district per student. So no, I think we're going to have to consider any plans on the table from all of these angles without one known state definition of education equity.
Given some of what you just described, I wonder if some of our existing system, and I know that there would sort of pass all of these tests at this point. We know that there's huge disparities in opportunity and spending from district to district, despite a funding formula that was designed to fix that. And certainly a big difference in tax bills from district to district. Is that something you've thought about at all?
Sure. And you are all equally qualified to opine on that as I am, right? I don't think there's any need to put into the record of this meeting a lawyer for the state reciting the constitutional problems with our current system. But yeah, I mean, again, I would urge you to think about a hypothetical plaintiff and what would be their best evidence to prove that there are problems with the data that we see now.
Nicole, are you interested in opining on that so that Emily doesn't have to?
I'm interested in opining on a similar thread, and that is, Act 60 was both funding formula changed and education quality standards. And I think we've talked about this as a commission. The state has under-resourced the quality piece of that legislation because agency staffing has been reduced over time. The capacity to monitor quality has changed. And so I just think this is a cautionary. We need to be looking at Act 60 implementation with understanding that sometimes the funding change is the easiest thing to do. The quality and the monitoring is harder. And if we don't do both at once, not great outcomes will result from this change. And so I think the state has always recognized the need to monitor quality and opportunity, but we haven't done a good job of actually doing it. And that needs to change.
Nicole, I really appreciate you raising that because I am carrying around sort of just like in my head some random examples of times we took on significant policy change in this arena and it did not have the intended results because 3/4 of that legislation was either whittled away by legislators or because of implementation challenges or whatever it is. And I think a bunch of us are sort of carrying around those stories in our head as object lessons for this next phase. And I think it might be helpful for us to have that conversation in a slightly more organized way at some point soon. So I'm just going to sort of add that to agenda planning. Mike, do you want to jump in?
Yes, and actually on that point too, because one of the things that I was writing down as we were talking about this conversation and the previous one is that how we spend our money reflects our priorities. And I think we're trying to get an understanding, and I know that's why we've had a lot of the conversations. I know that's why Interim Secretary Saunders has produced some of the information, but I really think I would encourage the steering committee to look at ways to prioritize those conversations. We talked about some of the states. One of the states where my wife taught years ago was in Maryland, and they've developed a blueprint, a statewide blueprint, and funding is a piece of that. But what they looked at is what are our priorities as a state? Where do we need to allocate resources in a different way? And then how do we move forward based on that piece? I know a lot of our work, and Emily, a lot of the work that you're going to be doing starting in January is really on the short-term piece of cost drivers, cost containment. But I think part of the commission that I'm looking forward to is really those conversations of how can we rethink about our system in a way that focuses on learning and education in the classroom, and then takes a look at the allocation of those dollars within the framework of Brigham and allocates it in a way that makes sense in an era where we're expecting different things from schools, and ultimately we're expecting different things from children as opposed to where we were in the 20th century when I went to school. So I think I feel the same way that you do, Emily and Nicole, that I would really like to focus more on that a more system-wide approach in some of our conversations, and then how the education finance can support that.
And I don't want to speak for the Senate ever, but I will say that I know that committees in the House are planning to both look at short-term and long-term, because long-term things have to start for them to ever happen, right? Even if they take a while. And so the full sort of menu and the need to have multiple courses, from our list that we've been working on is something that I think the House plans to take up. Zoe, go ahead. Unless you were, I'm sorry, were you done, Michael?
Yes.
Okay, great. I feel like my cues are lacking today. Sorry about that. Zoe, go ahead.
Absolutely. Yeah, I want to emphasize that point. As we're doing this work, it's really critical that we're thinking about sustainability, but we're also thinking about how the dollars are spent to really improve student opportunities. And I think that's critical. As we go into this work, it's also about how do you create a framework that's really focused on continuous improvement. So just as we needed to break down our funding system, because our funding system is very complex, right? We needed to give transparency to that funding system. We also need to give transparency to how we're defining school quality. But doing that in a way that is not punitive, but is done in a way that's really focused on driving continuous improvement and identifying practices that are working really well in parts of the state that could be leveraged in other parts of the state, right? So I just want to put that out there, that as we talk about that, there's some clarity that needs to be given around how we are currently defining education quality, because I would argue that our state accountability framework is very complex and very opaque in a similar way that our funding system is, right? And so we just need to think about that, and I do think it's important to bring it into the conversation. And as we are engaged in the listen and learn across the state, we're hearing around what is the best way to measure quality, right? The state assessment is one data point, but there's other components that need to be brought into that conversation to really have a well-rounded view around performance. So I really just wanted to emphasize those points and think it'll be really important for us to bring that in to the commission's work as we really start to think about what does it mean when we're talking about education quality.
Thanks. So I'm going to tie up this agenda item with a little bow unless someone has something they would like to add. Okay. And we have one outstanding agenda item from our last meeting that I'd love to spend at least 15 minutes talking about if we can, which is excess spending thresholds. It was sort of the last thing on our chart and we never got to it. And so I'm going to see if Nicole, you want to sort of kick us off on this because I think you've been thinking about it quite a bit. And so if folks remember, we have the chart that sort of talks about, you know, when things are, when something can pass, when it would make a difference, how big an impact it could have, and then sort of the dynamics and trade-offs inherent in that.
I don't know if folks saw what Mike had done, I think, a beautiful job of cleaning up that spreadsheet and sent it out this morning. If it's helpful, Mike, for you to, I think that is on that spreadsheet. If you can sort of share that, you share your screen. I don't have it pulled up. I only have one screen today.
I have two screens. And I want to thank our chair for the wonderful opportunity to do this spreadsheet. I didn't realize how mind-numbing it would be.
You took on the task brilliantly, Mike, I would say.
Yes.
But I think just to sort of set it up, and I don't have this totally thought through at all. I just have some thoughts.
But can you turn her up for a second? Would Suzanne be able to give me ability to share? I can't share my screen.
Let me work on it.
Oh, Maureen, thank you.
So I think in the context of short-term cost containment, as opposed to what we've spent the bulk of today's meeting talking about, which is really longer-term structural changes, both on the funding side and on the governance and delivery side. The excess spend, can't see it.
Okay. It's giving me, we need permission to share your screen. Okay, I'll have to do something separately.
I mean, I can talk about it and then we can, I do want to look at your lovely spreadsheet at some point. I think you did great work. And I think I'm interested in, I think the goal is to get that in some form or fashion into the commission's full report. So seems like that could be a good use of a few minutes. But anyway, the current law, excess spending threshold and penalty is one lever that is used to suppress spending. And it keys off of education spending for equalized pupil, which is not directly linked in any way to some of the cost drivers that have been named. Staffing, mental health, but I don't even know how we would do that since we're still unpacking how we're tracking those expenses. But facilities, the number of buildings that we operate, and tuition have been three cost drivers that the associations have at least put on the table. And it also sort of districts that are able to operate at scale tend to have lower costs per equalized pupil. That does not mean they don't have a huge impact on the education fund, right? So just I've always wondered whether ed spending per equalized pupil is in and of itself is in fact a great lever to contain costs across the system, given that some of our larger districts pay their employees the most in the state, and perhaps have similar staffing levels. They're just spending their staffing in different ways, and the scale sort of hides the fact, or it masks the spending decisions that are being made in the larger districts. And so if there's an interest in short-term changes to the current funding formula that could address cost drivers, then you might want to think about tailoring the spending threshold or spending penalty to more closely link it to some of those cost drivers, such as staffing levels, such as class sizes, or how many buildings are being operated, or compensation levels. So I don't have anything beyond that. We haven't really talked about it as a group, but that was the concept, to start to unpack a lever that I think is generally effective in those districts that are approaching the threshold. It does impact decision making, for good or for bad. We don't really know in terms of the quality side, but it does impact budgeting decisions because it is a significant tax impact. And whether there's any interest in exploring different ways to use that lever that would ensure all districts are paying attention, not just those districts that I believe exceed the threshold largely because of lack of scale. So that's it. I don't know, Mike, what you had on the spreadsheet exactly about that, but
I think I'm sharing the spreadsheet at this point.
I see the spreadsheet.
True? Okay, great.
Yes, it's a little hard for me to read, but I see it.
I will read it because I feel like I've hit my computer capacity for Zooming. So the policy goal here is reduce spending, clarify relationship between voter decisions and tax rates, increase equity, ensure excess spending penalty is an effective lever in all districts, regardless of size, by focusing on cost drivers, as opposed to education spending per pupil. And then the other impacts and dynamics is possible structure for allowable growth rates as well. Depending on how the penalty is designed, will have impacts on number of personnel employed, number of buildings operated, et cetera. How are appropriate targets set and updated? How is Brigham adhered to if districts can opt to spend more than the direct payment amount, so that access to educational resources is dependent on the district where an individual lives? I have a question that's not in here. And it is, I'm not sure how to say this as delicately as I should, so I'm just going to give it a go. But I think there's a lot of places in the policy levers we have here where we might be creating an incentive for districts to just budget differently or use different line items, right? So the most sort of obvious version of that is when we put in place staffing limits, we might just be creating an incentive to contract, right? And I am nervous here that we could be creating sort of similar incentives for people to just be budgeting by using different line items if the excess spending thresholds are related to very specific line items. And I'm just curious if anyone has any ideas on how to prevent that. Because I think it's a really interesting idea, Nicole. I'm curious, it'll be good to look this year at how the excess spending threshold really shakes out in a post-pupil weighting environment, because I think it will be different than how it was before, but I don't really know quite how.
Yeah, so I was not thinking about specific line items, and Elizabeth may have more insights into what would, whether gaming would be possible or but I think if you think about, staffing, for example, and again, this is where it gets complicated, right? Because what kinds of staffing? Is it staffing per equalized pupil versus just a raw staff number? But I can't remember the figure, but and we have 1 to 4, maybe. Is that right? So does that sound about 1 staff member for every 4 students, not teachers, but staff? Sort of what would it take to get to a New England average or a statewide average? So districts that from a pure staffing, and I don't know how you would game that from, because it doesn't really matter how you code them. We are required as districts to report staffing to the agency. And if you do it by equalized pupil, then supposedly you've accounted for weight for need. But is there a way to calculate the differential between the state average and districts that have staffing levels below, and could some sort of monetary penalty be assigned to that? Again, it would have to be, is this a choice or is this a need? And I don't know how we unpack that. And whether that's a good use of collective time, if really what we should be focusing on is adjustments to a funding formula, right? But that's the concept.
I think just to respond to the question, there's different operational choices that schools are making around staffing, right? And I think, as we've said before, there are some assumptions that all small schools or all rural schools operate the same way in terms of their staffing and class size ratios, and that's not the case, right? And so I think part of what is helpful is to actually bring in an understanding of those operational choices and thinking about what are some best practices that could be leveraged. In the education funding report, we highlighted some of those and kind of talked about that there are different ways in which this work can be approached. And I think there's value in diving deeper into that. One of the things I've shared previously is for us to be able to do a deeper level of analysis in terms of class size. There's additional data we need from the field to do that beyond what we currently collect through StatBook. So just want to put that out there, but we can certainly bring in, based on some of the analysis that we've done already, looking at the way the codes are currently structured.
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
I was just going to make a comment in regards to the spirit of the gaming idea on whether or not districts would be able to do something like that. And I'm thinking that if, for instance, it was linked to staffing ratios, one small change that could be made in the data collection that is done at the agency level for teacher staff salary survey information is just to tweak it so that we also have to count and report on contracted personnel that are serving students within our buildings, because that would be the way, if we include those bodies as staff, even though they're not technically a salary and a benefit staff, they're a contracted service, then there would be no possible way to game that part of the system. On other levers, if you're thinking expenditures for, say, mental health services, and a district is told, code all of those here. And could people start budgeting and coding other things into that area that would make it look like they're spending more in that area? I think they could, but I think it would still be one of those situations where it would all be very clear data that would come through in a stat book. Being reported every single year and compared year over year for that district. It'd be pretty clear that that district was moving things into that area, whether they should or shouldn't be. I think you'd be able to ask that question.
And I think all these questions come to, what are we looking to measure also, right? Because in all of these conversations, we're trying to track different things. And so that would require the agency to do different data collection, right? And so we've started to do that in some key areas to make sure that we can have the level of specificity we need to be able to respond to some of these requests. And I think that's just important to note as we go forward. I also wouldn't want to limit our thinking based on our current data collection, right? Because we want to make sure that our data collection is aligning to an evaluation framework that supports our goals.
And I want to be clear that I think the phrase gaming sounds like malintent or fraud or things like that. And organizations seek to meet the needs of those that they serve. And I don't think there's anything nefarious about that at all. And I think bureaucracies often create systems that force people into doing that in very overly complex ways. And so, and I think it's really important that we are creating systems that are also sort of simplifying administrative burden as much as possible, especially at the district level. So, so we have 15 minutes left. We need to set our agenda for our next meeting. Some things that have come up are previous, I'm gonna stop sharing. Previous policy efforts and where they have gone right and wrong. We're all being asked to review the data tracking document. I'm sorry, I keep on calling it the wrong thing, Zoe. And the new report and bring questions for that. And what are other things? I know that we have this spreadsheet that Michael so kindly cleaned up, and I think maybe thought I was just being a complainer when I talked about how mind-numbing it was before he took on the task. So I'm glad we have shared that work. Thank you. And so folks should just make sure that they don't feel misrepresented by it. I want to be clear that we are not trying to seek consensus on those rows. We are seeking all voices in those rows. There's definitely sort of content in there that might even cancel each other out. We're not saying we vote for this policy area. We're just saying we have thought about these policy areas, and this is the considerations of that policy area. We would need to meet for a lot more hours to seek consensus, I think, on any of that. Okay, I'm gonna stop talking. Elizabeth, and then Michael.
Just in reference to that, the spreadsheet, and thank you to Michael for going through that for us. I know that at one point we talked about this being a tool that we use to fuel or inform the full commission, and possibly having some kind of link between this that we've all discussed and the actual memo of recommendation that Megan Roy is working on to submit to for the December 15th. I'm just wondering, like, what is our plan for doing that and linking these together? Because obviously with this and all of its detail, it isn't going to be able to be cut and pasted in, as I think I heard Megan say something about possibly doing. But you could have a reference to it and have it linked as a document into that recommendation. I just don't know what the plan is for how we get this to the full commission, how we talk about linking it in, and where it belongs.
So I think folks should take the time to read it this week if you can, for just errors, and let me know and I will fix them. And then we can pass it on to Megan. My understanding is she's looking at really including some version of this in the report, and maybe, as a table, and would maybe, remove a couple of the columns. But I think she's here. If she wants to say anything. She was here.
I am here. Sorry, I'm also playing with screens. Yeah, and I think as I'm listening to this conversation, which is really helpful, especially that last piece, just describing what that document is and isn't. It is not a consensus document. It is a surfacing of the various ideas and even a raising of the issues associated with that. I still think it's important for the General Assembly to have all of that. So and again, full commission, we'll talk about this because it will be the full commission's report. But my current thinking is that a streamlined version of this that is not so complex would be in the report as a summary. And then if it's possible to reference and link this, I think it would be important because there is a lot more in it. But again, I think the key is explaining what it is and what it's not at this stage.
And I want to be sort of explicit about one thing that we discussed last week, or whenever we last met, that there's even a row in there that I think we all agreed was not a good idea, but we left it in there as a way of making sure that that thinking was sort of passed on to the next group of people who are having this conversation. Mike, do you want to jump in?
Yes, 2 points. One of which is, as I was going through this weekend, I noticed that there are some things that have been mentioned that are not included. So is there some mechanism that we want to, I didn't want to change or alter anything that was put in. I just was trying to condense information. Is there a way, Emily, that you want anything added to that may be a possibility that's being discussed. Again, not necessarily something that I thought about, some things that weren't something that my association was advocating for at this time. But if we want it to be comprehensive, I think we should try to include everything that we can on the document.
Yes. Why don't people send new things to me? I'll add them to the document, and then at our next meeting or at the full commission meeting, you all can discuss those.
Okay. And then my second point was just a question for Zoe, and I'll preface it by saying it may be my own issues with my computer, but the data request status update had links in it, and I was having trouble opening those links on that document. Is that something, was it just me, or is it something that others noticed?
Didn't work for me either. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for flagging that. I wasn't aware that the links weren't working. So we certainly will make those updates and resend back, and we'll post a version where the links have been verified. So my apologies for that.
Yeah, it looks like the document you sent us, which was a memo probably from Word or something, that they came through fine. I'm wondering if it was something to do with the spreadsheet in Excel.
It might have been due to how we saved it, but I'll go back in and make sure that it's saved appropriately and you can access the links. So thank you for telling me.
Anyone else? Okay, for our next meeting then. I also want to name that I think there are a lot of other places that conversations are happening. And I feel really hopeful that any proposals for sort of the upcoming legislative session will be able to at least touch this commission or this committee at one point. Maybe not fully fleshed out, but I would just be bummed if there's a policy idea that's sort of waiting in the wings and is going to show up on January 15th that has not had at least a modicum of airing in this virtual room or physical room. So I am sort of like flushing ideas out of my colleagues in order to make sure they all sort of get their time. And I really hope everyone else here is doing that as well. There are like a lot of good times in life for surprises, like birthdays or I don't know what else, but like I feel like this is not an ideal time for surprises. So with that public service announcement, I'll go to you, Nicole.
Oh, I was just going to say the same thing. You know, I've taken note of the fact that the Senate has decided to clear its schedule for the first week or so to hear proposals from the administration. And one of the values, I think, of this body so far has been the opportunity to have folks from the legislature, folks from the administration, folks from the field coming together to talk through the complexity of some of these things. So I just want to reiterate that my hope is that if new ideas are coming, whether they be from the administration or whether they be from committee leaders or just members, and including our associations, that they are formally talked about here, because I do think this is a really positive, I have felt this has been a positive venue to have those conversations, and I hope that continues.
Thanks. Okay, so at our next meeting, gonna save time for sort of final pieces that we have not had time to air yet, or have not come up yet. Think about a way to have a conversation about sort of like previous large pieces of policy that have moved through and ways they succeeded or did not succeed. And I feel like I lost a third thing somewhere in the middle. What was the third thing? Maybe there wasn't one. Oh, any feedback or questions or ideas we have to go deeper on any of the documents that Zoe sent over the weekend. Okay, great. With that, I am going to thank you all for your time today.
And sorry, I'm going to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
December 9th in person, is that correct? Just want to verify before we get off.
Thank you for doing that.
It says in person on the meeting right now.
That's what I have. Does that work for folks, or would we rather do another virtual one?
I like the in-person. I don't have as
I will
far to
have to
go.
be-
That's also a piece.
I will have to be virtual that day, but I don't mind being a big head on a TV.
I'll join Craig with being a big head on a TV just because those are my days where I have all my board meetings, so I can't get there and back here in time for those meetings.
I will also actually have to be a big head on a screen for that meeting. So
I don't know, if that's half, maybe we should just do the virtual.
yeah, I think we're just gonna have to make it virtual. And then I think, so we're gonna sort of switch our order. Our next meeting after that is scheduled for the 23rd. Do we want to do that, or do we want to say this is that our next meeting is our final meeting before January?
I will not be at the meeting on the 23rd.
Okay. Anyone else?
I vote with Craig.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so our next meeting will be virtual and it will be our final meeting before January. And at that point, we will also figure out what we are doing once the session starts. Okay. Thank you, everyone. You're wonderful. I'll see you soon.